Hello, and welcome to today's web discussion on the coronavirus and the impact on the MRO supply chain. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment just to thank all of you for joining us today amidst this um, challenging environment. Everyone's adjusted so quickly in response to the pandemic, and I think we'll see that virtual meetings like this one are going to quickly become the new norm as we scramble to adapt in this rapidly changing business environment. This webinar is the first forum for the MRO problem solvers, a collective of like-minded individuals in the supply chain ecosystem working together to solve problems and advance the industry. Throughout the year, we'll get together in forums like today's webinar. We'll also share case studies and communicate best practices from amongst this community so that we can hopefully work together and help each other along our journey. Just a few points of housekeeping before we start. All attendees enter the Teams app on mute. Microphones and webcams are disabled. That's just the way the program works. But we'd like to encourage as much interactivity as possible. So on the screen, you'll see the Q&A chat box to your right. Go ahead and enter any questions, issues, concerns that you have in that chat box. I'll monitor it during the presentation. If Brian doesn't get to your question during the presentation, we will address it at the end in the Q&A section. Today's call is being recorded, so if you'd like a copy of the recording, please feel free to email me at sales@sdi.com, and we'll be happy to provide it. Today's presenter is Brian Harmon, the Director of Procurement at SDI. Brian is responsible for ensuring the company's supply base works harmoniously in a connected ecosystem to better serve their clients. A dynamic supply chain professional with a track record of rapid growth through delivered results for SDI and previously with such companies as CRC Industries and Dorman Products, Brian is adept at overcoming complex supply challenges, establishing strategic alliances, and fostering positive supplier relations. With that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for being here today. These are interesting times for us all. This is certainly a major event affecting all of our lives. We're seeing the impact at our local grocery stores, and much of us are living in a state of either plant or office shutdown. We're under curfews, working from home. It's an interesting time indeed, but just so we're all clear, the scope of this, we're really not here to discuss the state of the outbreak itself or predict any short or long-term supply chain impacts of the virus. We're really here to just talk about, the things that your organization should be asking itself, really, in terms of, how to best manage through this and how it'll impact your MRO supply chain. Okay, so we just wanted to just talk about how this relates to other crises we've seen in the past. This really, even though these are unprecedented times, we've seen a lot of this kind of stuff before. The last 50 or so years that SDI has been at this, we've been through Y2K, H1N1, we all experienced 9/11. But really, what's different this time? Obviously, the scale of this pandemic is much longer or much larger than we've ever seen before. And I think just the economic climate is a bit different as well. Despite there being recent trade and tariff pressures that have generated a lot of near-sourcing strategies for suppliers, we're still very much heavily reliant on the global economy, particularly China. None of that should be news to any of you. But it is something that's notably different than how the company the country has navigated some of these crises before in the past compared to now. Moving on here to the next slide. So who should care and why? From a sourcing and purchasing standpoint, obviously continuity of supply is paramount here. One of the statistics we got from McKinsey has said that the capacity to ship goods from factories to ports is around 60 to 80% of what is normal. And with goods facing delays, of around 8 to 10 days on the normal journey. We see that, potentially to continue to bottleneck and maybe, further extended. So we need to kind of prepare for some of these longer term delays. As far as how that impacts, maintenance teams, the planning and scheduling of maintenance work and repair is all the more critical. I think we're moving into a time where that type of work needs to be, planned a little bit further out in the future. In terms of how it'll impact storerooms, the ability to maintain inventory is going to be critical, right? I mean, as when we run into supply delays, when spikes in demand come through, the ability to have a solid track on our inventory is critical. If we have any visibility gaps in inventory, it can cause further problems. As far as operations go, obviously uptime concerns is huge. Keeping the lines running is paramount. For engineering, it's all about reliability. The HSC categories are critical for us. This is, your health and safety equipment type of categories. This is actually the product category that we're seeing the largest spikes in demand. I mean, obviously these are your face masks, your disinfectants, all the stuff that we're all hearing about on the news that you can't hardly find on the shelves at the grocery stores and things. These are also, spiking with all of the major distributors out there. It's hard to find. Supply and demand is sending pricing through the roof, and that directly ties in with that next bullet point on finance. That we're seeing big cost spikes. I mean, just things like masks. We used to see it about 50 cents a pop, are now going as high as $5 if you can even get them. So as far as marketing and sales, same thing. The line goes down, we can't ship the product, customers are unhappy, they're looking elsewhere. So it's really impacting everybody. I mean, the customers are concerned about not getting what they need, and ultimately, or even our suppliers are worried about protecting their primary customers. And we're even seeing allocation trends with certain suppliers based off of prior volumes. They're declaring force majeure in some cases. We're seeing what we've recently started to see here is, some companies are starting to declare critical infrastructure industry priorities, meaning they're giving priority of their product availability to clients that are in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industries, to help make sure that they keep their wheels turning while the country works to battle this virus. What really should you be asking yourself? Really, is MRO a part of the plan? I mean, it's kind of a fundamental part of this, but a lot of times, companies in periods of crisis, they're focused on their direct spend. That's where all their horsepower and thought process goes toward. They're just not thinking about what do they need to do to make sure they protect their MRO spend and all of their, particularly their large scale maintenance repair operation work. Do you have visibility on that demand? That's a big part of it. I mentioned this earlier as far as trying to plan ahead with any kind of scheduled repair. The more you can look long range, the better you'll have an idea of what you need to buy well in advance. Again, we mentioned inventory accuracy, that's critical. Critical spares. This is something that's worth really talking about. This is what we, as in SDI, that's what we refer to, specific SKUs that are absolutely critical to your operation. You can ask a maintenance guy, ask him what's critical, say everything's critical, but really you got to step back and ask yourself, hey, what are the top speed lines? What are the critical areas of the operation that if that goes down, it can severely impact the business? If you focus on those areas of the operation and the items within those categories that are longer lead times and things, that's going to help you identify where your critical spares are and where you need to make some adjustments. Country of origin is also something that needs to be incorporated into your critical spare review. It may be something that has never really been a part of your paradigm, really, in terms of worrying about. There's a lot of this a lot of the MRO is bought through distribution, 2-3 day lead times. But there's a lot of items bought through those distributors that originate out of China or anywhere along, any from any kind of global source, really. I mean, we're even seeing, throughout Europe, they're shutting down their borders and things. So even, it's not necessarily Asia, right? It's anywhere abroad. Anything that's going to be going through the ports is of concern. So, there's ways to look at, what your country of origin is. Obviously, you can be reaching out to your suppliers to ask them, what the country of origin is for all items. That is, it's a legal requirement that they provide that. They'll have that on file. They can share with you where your long lead time items. And obviously, anything that you're buying directly from overseas, from say OEMs in Europe or whatever it might be, those are items you really want to look at, beefing up on your minimum order quantities, your safety stocks, and trying to pull forward any forecasted demand as much as you can. Also, just looking at the relationships you have with your key suppliers. This is a good time to reestablish those relationships. If you haven't connected with them in a while, make sure you touch base with them, understand what their challenges are. It might even be worth doing some surveys with your critical suppliers to understand where they stand, what strategies are they doing to mitigate. And lastly, do we have any scheduled turnarounds that could be impacted? That's just talking about your any kind of maintenance repair schedules you've got. So the last section here is really we've got it broken up into 4 parts. It's a framework for action. It's a 4-part matrix here around change, demand, supply, and sourcing. So we've got a slide for each here. So when you talk about change management, it's really critical to identify the most relevant risks to your MRO supply chain operations. You want to, try to do best to define possible outcomes and assess the high level impact, right? This kind of goes back to what I was saying about the critical spares. This is also a good point here to mobilize a cross-functional team, and a lot of times instead of just the same folks that normally work with those items to pull in a group where you get some diversity of perspective, make sure you're asking all the right questions, and then identifying your primary drivers of MRO usage. This is in terms of major events, whether it's repair work, any kind of CAPEX projects you've got, like trying to look out over the course of the year what you've got budgeted for the year. Now's the time to take a look at all of that and see what you can do to manage how that is handled. So in terms of the demand management, this is a critical piece that frankly we tend to see a lot of our clients and other folks in the industry. This is an area that's of challenge. When in the MRO space, these are typically items that are not forecasted. Typically, the requirements are determined based off of a break and fix strategy versus preventative maintenance. The more you can get into a mode of preventative maintenance, trying to look at and schedule out, your repair work, the better you're going to be able to forecast your demand, rather than waiting, right up upon lead time. Because if you're waiting to the 2 or 3 day lead time turnaround that you're used to, you may run into some problems there. And that's a big part of trying to forecast as best you can. So for the supply management piece, a big part of this really is just to try to better manage the storeroom, try to understand what kind of physical inventories you've got, make sure that you expose any kind of squirreled away inventories. Locking down the storeroom 24/7 is critical to make sure you don't have any shrinkage or leakage. And really, rationing the demand and really controlling the point of supply is an area that we see that our clients are able to really benefit from, particularly by implementing some vending, utilizing some vending machines in those locations. We typically see about a 30% reduction in consumption on those types of high usage items. through the usage of vending is a strategy worth considering. So min-maxes, looking at if you're getting a good idea of what your demand is, adjusting your mins and maxes is a good time to do that. Typically your min a lot of times is just based off of your typical order lead time. You may want to build in some extra safety stocks, look at increasing those to be twice what your lead times typically are, on those critical items. So the last couple points are really around looking at what we call OEM commercialization. Essentially what that is taking a look at any of your critical spares that are long lead times, maybe they're high value, to taking a look at what can you do to either re-engineer those items into something that's a bit more generic, that's more readily available through distribution. A lot of times items like this get spec'd in through our engineers that might be constructing something that's very customized that really it makes a lot of sense for that application, but for long-term supply chain sustainability can hurt you, particularly when you're looking at supply delays like we've got now. And if there's any opportunity to convert those types of products to more readily available versions, this is certainly the time to do it. So from a sourcing management standpoint, the first bullet point here is around initiating guerrilla sourcing tactics. And really what we mean by that is, if you think about, guerrilla warfare that's operating under a loose chain of command, they're agile, they hit hard and fast. That's what you want to think about here, in terms of your typical sourcing process. It's worth taking a step back and looking at, your general business process around, approvals and budget constraints and even empowering your employees to push down a level in terms of level of authority of where decisions can be made, so they can be made on the fly. You can be a bit more agile. That's an important thought to build into your process as we get into a state of delay like we're seeing here with the coronavirus. Form, fit, and function, looking at alternative sources. Obviously, this is something that we're constantly doing for our clients. Particularly when we start to see delays from longer lead time options, we're looking at alternatives. Networking, benchmarking best practices. Even exploring some non-traditional sources of supply. Typically the thing that comes to mind here is looking at remanufactured items, instead of maybe buying new every time. Maybe you can buy it, through an alternative source, maybe even lower cost, but it may be more readily available than trying to buy it new from the manufacturer. On the flip side, going direct to the manufacturer is also worth considering. If you're typically buying, whether it's a Honeywell or GE type product, you're buying it through distribution, and you're running into delays through the distributor, it doesn't hurt to reach out to the manufacturer. It may not always work, but sometimes it does. And lastly on here, the last piece is around the planning. These are a couple of standard tactics, right? When you start running into supply crunch, looking at forward buys, looking at blanket orders to lock up supply. So the benefit of the blanket order, obviously you're not going to be taking the inventory impact, but you at least get that commitment from your supplier. All right, well that wraps up the majority of our content here. I guess I'll hand it over here to Deb to walk us through the Q&A section.
Great job, Brian. Thank you. The first question we have says, what percentage of MRO products are manufactured in China, Italy, and other regions where the virus has resulted in complete shutdowns?
So obviously it's super difficult to estimate across the board. It varies by industry, by company, but we know it's very large, right? It's far higher than 30%. We've seen in some cases it's as high as 60%, depending on the industry.
Well, what can people do if they have a lot of supplies coming from China or Italy? how do you find alternate sources, or how do you even find the country of origin?
Right. So, well, country of origin is something that's, like I said, it's required by law. The supplier, whether it's a distributor or it's the manufacturer, is required to provide you with that information. It's important to note that country of origin is defined by the country in which the product experienced significant transformation. So if the product is some kind of an assembly, let's say like a radiator fan, it's very possible, the shroud of the product is made in, say, Korea, but the motor itself is from China. And it's wherever the assembly of that product, say it's assembled in a different country, whether it's the U.S., they can say the country of origin is the U.S. So just be careful of that if it's a larger assembly. But typically you're going to want to look for items with countries of origin from the far reaches of the globe and look at alternatives there. I mean, one other piece of advice I would make from a sourcing strategy standpoint, if you have those types of items, you can subscribe to, there's a lot of web services out there that deal with, say, manifest journals and customs data where you can, you can gain access, you can do queries on the types of products you're buying, and you can see who's manufacturing them, you can see who's buying them in the U.S. And that could steer you into alternative distributors you can work with and or just other manufacturers.
Great. Next question says, we've heard of the bullwhip effect for supply chains. Can you talk a little about that in the context of MRO?
Sure. I mean, it's the bullwhip phenomenon always happens when you have any kind of crisis like this, and heck, some of the advice I gave above around, forward buys and blanket orders and things, those actually propagate the bullwhip effect. But it's a catch-22. It cuts both ways, right? I mean, you want to pull ahead demand, but at the same time, if everybody does it, it just slows down everybody from getting what they need or the supplier's ability to catch up. But at the same time, if you don't, you'll be the last one to get products. So it is a phenomenon that we all got to deal with, and it's there's not a whole lot of a good way around it. I'd like to say let's all stay calm and continue with our regular order patterns, but if everyone else buys ahead and you don't, you're going to be out of product.
That's a good segue into the next question, Brian. What are the items that are most likely to be in short supply in the coming weeks or months? Is that something you can comment on?
Sure. Yeah, I did mention it above. It's within the health and safety areas. I mean, obviously we're all seeing it. Even toilet paper is a hot commodity right now in the janitorial supplies category. Any of the disinfectants, cleaners, hand sanitizer. I mean, we're all seeing this stuff on the news. This isn't anything new. But masks, ventilators, all that stuff are hard to come by at the moment.
A couple more questions here. Does an MRO industry association exist where users and buyers can access supply information and share best practices?
Well, Deb did mention earlier in the intro.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can take that actually, Brian.
Sure.
The next, let's see. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do here is start this community of practice around solving problems with the supply chain. Unfortunately, there's not an association like ISM that focuses solely on MRO right now. But what we're trying to do here is just get like-minded individuals together to discuss the problems in MRO supply chain. The next event is going to be Tuesday, March 31st, when we'll talk about using data analytics to return us to something close to normal and help plan for continuity of supply in the future. So the plan is to follow on with an interactive forum and knowledge base. So that's next steps. I think after that, the last question is around sharing the presentation with the attendees. We are recording this presentation currently, so check your inbox after the event. Whitelist sales at sdi.com. It'll come from MRO Problem Solvers, but that's the email. We'll follow up with a survey and a link to the recording as well. And like I said, this is just the start of what we hope will be a community. We hope you'll join us for the next one. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add, Brian? No, I want to thank Brian Harmon for taking us through this discussion. If you have any other questions, feel free to email us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much.